Ian, it is so great to be back with you for part 2 of our interview, where we are going to dive in to all things science and spirituality.
Love
And
it.
yes, stoked. So I wanted to start by saying you're different. It is rare. It's really rare to find a scientist who's so accomplished. You've worked with NASA to develop gamma ray shielding for space travel to Jupiter's moon, Europa. You've developed a litany of supplements to help people with everything from Alzheimer's to cancer to simply being super oxygenated and fit.
Yeah.
And you're also deeply spiritual.
Yeah.
You're deeply like I would say immersed in a kind of spiritual experiential understanding of things. And so I'm really stoked to dive in and just chat with you about your perspective on things.
Yeah, I'd almost say you're not spiritual, you're just very aware. And this spiritual word needs to kind of disappear. It's just about being.
Right.
It's about being natural.
Well, it's experiential, right? Well, at least for me, it was experiential. There was, quite a few decades of hardcore meditation and constantly trying to push and to grow and to do and to be and all this stuff. And it's kind of ironic because at the end of the day, I used to get very frustrated, with the people who would say like, you must know it to be true. And just at the moment it is there, it will be there and that kind of stuff. And I was always just very procedural. And I was like, look, just lay out the steps in a linear progression so I can follow them, so I can do whatever this whole expansion of consciousness thing was. It was a very mechanistic sort of approach to it. And then the bitch of it was when actually, I went through that process and the transition sort of happened. I was like, wow, damn, they were right. And ultimately the funniest bit was you realize after you go through the experience of kind of your consciousness shifting, you realize that you don't, the concept of, I'm climbing the mountain and I'm doing all these things, that's a total fallacy. You're actually clinging for dear life, holding on to your very limited, very subjective perspective. And then at the moment when things happen, it's a release and you just let go and you're, very much pulled up, and it was kind of an awakening in the most literal sense to go, oh, wow, I've been holding myself down this entire time. and then when you release, whoop, you just get carted up. But it's kind of very much akin to the way nature works, where everybody's like, oh, the wind is blowing. Well, actually, that's not really true. The wind is being drawn past you. It's being pulled into a low pressure center. It moves towards something that is a lower pressure center behind you. And it's not actually being forced to you. It's kind of, first law of thermodynamics, things move from higher energy to lower energy and fill the void, and it's that kind of nature abhors a vacuum. And so it's a very beautiful process. And it's not really shocking. The other thing that from the scientific perspective that was kind of fascinating to me is consciousness, at least the way we express consciousness in a human form, moves through transitions very much like water moves through state changes. You put in a tremendous amount of energy and it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And then it hops up, in chemical terms, you'd say water has a very high specific heat capacity. So it holds itself at a very set point for a long time. And then it jumps. And consciousness, as it turns out, is the same. We put in a lot of work, we do a lot of effort, we do all these things for lifetimes and lifetimes. And then at a certain point, whoop, it jumps up to the next state and then it stabilizes at that state. And all the while, just like in a boiling pot of water, you have little blips where, a bubble will pop up and kind of, jump out. And that's kind of what your consciousness does too, is at these different points, you'll have these really profoundly transformative experiences where it's a very transcendent sort of thing and you're outside of yourself and you have the kind of the expanded awareness and then whonk, you crush yourself back into your own suitcase of consciousness, and then you get back on the road and you kind of do your thing. And then eventually, it happens again. And then at least with my experience, you know, and I'll just, in my personal experiences, I'd literally, you know, I'd been a diehard vegetarian for about 28 years and did that solely for the purpose of clarity, right? Trying to keep myself as clean and as pure as I could, because I just kind of felt intuitively that that was more in keeping with what I wanted to do, was to be just absolutely clean. Did a lot of meditation, yoga, that kind of stuff, literally for decades. And then I was driving between my lab and a place in Dallas in Texas. And I was driving down the road and I was listening to David Hawkins. And I had been working on calibrations for, I don't know, like 6 months. And I would always recommend anybody read Power versus Force. It's a brilliant book. So David Hawkins, MD, PhD, really, really super bright guy, but more importantly, a very evolved guy. And so I was buzzing down the road. And as I'm driving down the road, you know, kind of just driving, listening to this, my right arm whips up, you know, in this position, involuntarily, I might add, and locks in that position. And then it felt like the entire top of my head exploded and tears just started streaming down my face. And I consciously, I thought, oh shit, I'm having a stroke. Because I didn't know, I had never felt anything like that. You know, my arm is locked in a position. I can't move it. My head feels like it's, you know, blowing up, and tears are just, you know, involuntarily streaming down my face. And it was insanely profound. The feeling was just overwhelming. So I literally, I pulled off the road and just sat there, you know, just crying. And then when it passed, I was like, whoa, what the hell was that? That was wild. And then the next day it happened again. And then the next day it happened twice. And the day after that, it happened 3 times. And it just kept happening over and over. And, you know, I'm a reasonably bright guy, so I caught on kind of quickly that, oh, something is going, you know, strange things are afoot at the Circle K. So, you know, something is happening to my consciousness here. And it just kept going. And then it became a persistent state. And it was kind of profound. You know, I mean, effectively, it felt like I had a halo, you know, by the end of the thing that just never went away. And so, you know, ever being the scientist, I started playing with it to see what effects different things would have on it. One of which, one of the more interesting things was kind of that when I would listen to either chants, whether it was Vedic chants or, you know, Christian chants or anything like that, it would expand. You know, the pressure, if you will, would get larger and it was more intense. And that was kind of a wild experience. And so that was just sort of the first phase. And that went on for months and months and months and months and months. And then it kind of locked in. And when it locked in, there was definitively sort of a transition of awareness. And it was the first of a few. And that was the other thing. It truly very much like the state changes in water. You know, let's say your consciousness is on ice, and then eventually it jumps up and thaws, and then you become water. You know, and then it goes on, and then it jumps up again, and you become water vapor. And you know, you've put in a lot of energy at every point, and the experience was shockingly different, right? So in order to stabilize at that first point, and again, you know, I don't know if everyone's experience is the same, but for me, the thing that was interesting was I had to purge every bit of stress from this particular lifetime to lock in, you know, kind of with a state of permanence at that point. And that was a bit rough, actually, because the thing that was peculiar was you don't actually process through, or at least, again, I don't know anybody else's experience, but my own experience was I wasn't processing through the things from my perspective. I processed through them from the perspective of all the people with whom I had interacted. And truly, not as like me watching them, but as me being them. And it was kind of intense. So luckily, I actually have lived a pretty nice and kind life. So it really wasn't that hard. The thing that was actually the hardest was the points where I really hurt people that I had no clue I had even done it. It was some exchange where, because of the kind of like the relative weighting of how you put certain people's words, you know, like if my father says something to me, it's going to have a whole lot more import than if, you know, just some random person I've never met says something to me, right? And what happened was when I was reliving these things from the other person's perspective, the thing that was fantastic was I would just like blow up because I would experience it as them. And sometimes, unfortunately, they were things that they had put great weight on because it was me interacting with them, and it would just devastate them. And they would keep a stiff upper lip and never say anything. And holy cow, man, talk about just oof. That really drove it home. It was interesting. So that was kind of like that. That was the first phase of it. The second phase was actually a little different from my experience. Typically in the second phase, you kind of have to purge, again, my own experience here. And I don't want to, kind of foist my experience on anybody else, because I'm not certain if everybody has the same experience, because it's a pretty vast universe with a lot of stuff going on. But my experience is that to kind of stabilize in that second stage, you actually have to go back and purge quite a few lifetimes worth of stuff. And it's basically the same process, but it's every one of them that you've done. The interesting thing about that is at the end of that point, you will truly harbor no judgment for another person ever, because you will have been really not the best. You won't have always been a Boy Scout, so you will have been a murderer. You will have been, a thief. You will have pretty much anything that you would kind of like come down on and think ill of. You will have been that at some point. And so at the end of that process, you kind of learn you work through it. It sucks. But at the end of the process, you'll never harbor judgment for another person, because you realize, oh, it's just a process. I always joke that you don't really get pissed off at second graders because they can't do differential equations, right? It's just, that's not where they are in school, right? So, if they're having a hard time with multiplication, you can't expect them to do, DE3 stuff. I mean, it's just, everything is kind of a gradient and an evolution of consciousness and the expressions thereof. And so that was kind of a profound thing. And then the transition right after that, which is incidentally why I eat meat now, is when I knew that that point was coming up, I simply asked the question, because I had reached the point where I was physically disassociated from my form, right? Like the kind of the form that I'm in now. I would literally have to look to see where it was, because it sounds like some, sort of psychologically disassociative thing. And it was in a sense, but not in the normal sense. It was just more like you wouldn't really be so attached to your car, right? Because it's your car, like it's your car. You take care of your car, but you don't know if somebody says, "Hey, where's your bumper?" You kind of like, I'm gonna go look at it. and it's literally about like that, because you no longer relate to it the same way, because your vantage has shifted, and it's a fundamentally different experience when you just kind of look at it as like, oh, this is the vessel that I'm using to move me through this particular reality. And so at that point, I asked the question, like, well, if I'm this disassociated from this form now, what happens at this next jump that I'm looking at? And I quite literally heard a voice, and it said, "You leave." And I said, "Oh, well, I don't want to leave." And it said, "Then eat meat." And I said, "But I don't eat meat." And then the voice just said, "And that too is a choice." And that was it. That was so. And I hadn't had any meat for about 28 years. And, kind of the way your physiology works is you have all of the enzymatic processes that break that down, to break down meats. And if you don't utilize them, they go away over time. Your body's super efficient, and it looks for kind of the best homeostatic balance. So it just eliminates that enzymatic process, and you lose those enzymes. So for the previous decade, if I had had anything where somebody accidentally put meat in something, I was doubled over in pain in the bathroom all day. Like, it was bad. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, I don't want to go, so I'm going to, just go do this meat thing. So I went out and I bought some sausage, bought a pound of bacon, and thought, okay, this is going to absolutely just devastate this body. But, I'll work through it. So I went out, I got it, cooked it, ate all of it. Nothing happened. I thought, oh, okay, cool. So it was kind of funny from a scientific perspective, because I thought, okay, well, I guess it's all energetic after all, and the thing is, it's really more of an anchor, because the vibration is very slow. So, if I were literally living on orange juice, almonds, milk, honey, and ghee, I probably wouldn't be able to be having this conversation because I'd be just sitting with my eyes closed, meditating, and somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and if you're eating that sort of, really high energetic stuff, then your vibrations are very different. And I kind of needed a tether. So for me, that was the tether. And luckily, it turns out the tether is quite yummy. So
Uh,
not
yeah,
gonna lie,
I do love
bacon's pretty
bacon.
tasty.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of a reward in and of itself. So
Mm. So consciousness is just energy, and the physical realm is just energy, and ultimately everything is just energy. So what's all this about from your perspective? What are we doing here?
I think it's more of a play of consciousness, just a growth and an experience for the sake of experience. Kind of an experiential knowingness through all the different facets. Kind of as much as it sounds silly, kind of playing hide and go seek with yourself. It's much more fun than just sitting idly, doing nothing. I mean, there is a sort of inherent for anybody who's really done a lot of hardcore meditation, that there is sort of a bliss that comes with just being absolutely still and going away, because your consciousness just kind of at a certain point it dissipates, and then you just kind of become awareness, and that's it. You can hear things that are transpiring around your form and all that, but you're not really there. You don't associate with it. It's a very blissful kind of point. And in fact, after you sort of stabilize in that, all of this becomes that. But to your point, I think it's just kind of playing hide and go seek with ourselves. I mean, I love talking to you guys. It's fun. I love the stuff that we get to do together. It's great play. It beats the heck out of just sitting with my eyes closed in my room all the time. So, and butter pecan ice cream, can I say it's pretty good. I mean,
Yeah. Our guide there
are certain things that I very much enjoy kind of in this whole physical milieu. I think it's great.
Yeah. It's like, enjoy your food while you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Literally, I was in New York last night. And of course, when you're in New York, you get pizza, right? That's just what you do. So I, landed very late, schlepped out at about 2 a.m. to go to Rosie's Pizza and get some eggplant parm pizza at 2 a.m. in New York, because that's what you do when you're in New York. Similarly, when you're in a body, you do body stuff. It's kind of fun, and it's not permanent. It's certainly not where I'm going to be forever. It's a really groovy stopping point.
Exactly. Well, Alcazar once said, all these different dimensions and realities and experiences, it's just God dreaming.
That's interesting. Somebody asked me why we dream, and I said, well, I think it's so you have a template of what it's like to wake up. Because when your consciousness sort of stabilizes up a bit, Buddha actually was asked a similar question. Someone said, are you a god? And he said, no. And they said, well, are you a saint? He said, no. And they said, well, what are you? And he said, I'm awake. And there's a lot of truth to that, because when the veil sort of gets lifted, that really is kind of the thing that happens. It's very much like being awake. And you also get, depending on sort of the level of awareness that you have, you definitely get the ability to move and change and manipulate, if you will, just sort of the physical reality around you. I mean, and the only reason I feel comfortable talking about that is, I mean, you guys have seen me do that kind of stuff. It's, it's just, if you want to change the color or the flavor of something, or some attribute of form of something, it's pretty easy to do once your consciousness is operating at a certain level. It almost seems a little parlor tricky, but it's just reality opens you up, as it's kind of like a lens. And the more you dilate the aperture, and the greater your perspective and the more control you have over it, the more coherent you are as a form, the more capable you are of manipulating the other forms here and eliciting a certain response, right? So if I want to change the smell of something or change the flavor of something, it's very easy, because all of those things are literally olfaction and gustation are vibratory functions, right? There's a very definable quantum biological effect where you can look at the oscillatory rates of things. And there's some really great experiments that have been done about it. There's actually a really good book called Life on the Edge, which is one of the books I used to teach in my class for biochem, that, you know, kind of goes through a lot of those experiments. It's all vibration. And when you realize that everything is simply vibration, you kind of start to go, hey, wait a second. Okay, if the precept is all this stuff is vibrating, nothing is really actually solid. Well, okay, what does that mean? You know, it's kind of like density, right? If you want to change the density of something, then you simply, density is a probability, right? And this will, to give a little sciencey. So you've got orbital clouds of electrons, right, that are probabilistically moving in a certain region. The density of an object, let's say lead versus, let's say oxygen, right? Lead has many, many, many more electrons than the orbital shells floating around. So there's a much higher probability that when you push something with lead, you're going to get pushback from the electron cloud against your own electron cloud. And that will express as a density, right? So there's a higher probabilistic expression that you're going to feel a force coming back at you. Now, if you think about it in terms of coherence, the more coherent you become with yourself, you can shift probabilities. You become effectively a probability engine. So if you want to make yourself more dense, you can simply make yourself more dense because you coalesce all of the probabilistic locations to be in one particular region. And you know, you guys know Carl, the phlebotomist I work with. You know, this is when... And you can ask him about this because it kind of, I was watching a thing one time and I saw a monk do something similar where they, you know, made their skin as strong as iron. And I thought, oh, cool. Okay. I get that. And then I thought, well, how the hell am I going to test that? You know, nobody ever puts a spear on me. And then I thought, wait a second, Carl stabs me every week. This is great. So I waited for Carl to come in, and then I kind of got myself centered, waiting for him to do his, you know, needle stick, and shifted as much as I could at the point. And he was pushing and pushing and pushing, and he finally got the needle through, and then he pulled it back and it was bent. He was like, dude, what the hell? You can ask him about it. It's, you know, it's kind of fun, but it was the thing. I wanted to see if it was possible, and sure enough, it's possible.
You just play with your consciousness. Like, what were you thinking to create that?
Well, I was literally just thinking skin of iron. And it was because the show that I had it was a thing called Stanley's Superhumans. And basically my take is, when you see that something is possible for one of the other critters here, it's possible for any of us, right? Yeah. So, you know, so I thought, oh, okay, I get it. This guy can do this. Well, then I should be able to do that. And, you know, and I was talking to another friend of mine. He's a neuroscientist, Dr. Drew Pearson. And Drew, I had asked him about other people doing that, and he had some great video that he had taken. And he said, you know, I can show it to people, but I can't share it because it was, you know, one of his patients. But the guy that he had in the video had done the same thing. He took a light bulb, and it was a clear glass light bulb, and he held it up to his head, and he was changing the density. And then he held it out, and it took, you know, maybe a minute. He held it out and dropped it, and he dropped it into a box. And when it hit, they had a tile in the box, and it hit the tile and it shattered the tile. So, and it's the thing that's the most peculiar is the tone is what's a giveaway, because when it hits, it sounds like a piece of metal hitting, not like a piece of glass. And again, it's a probabilistic shift, right? And I said, well, what was that guy's process? And he said, well, he asks the light bulb to do this, right? Because here, everything is an expression of consciousness. Right. You know, now I don't know all of the other universes. I don't know all of the other planes or dimensions, but I can definitively say, in my experience in this particular place, at least from my own perspective, everything you see around you is an expression of consciousness. Everything started as a subtle form before it became a tangible form in matter. Yeah. And when you know that that is the case, then everything has attributes that are malleable. And if you're kind enough and nice enough and have a strong enough awareness, you can pretty much ask anything to do anything, and it will typically oblige. You know, as long as, and the other thing there is, when your awareness reaches a certain level, you're not going to ask something to do something detrimental, because it's not ecologically sound, and unless you're likely not going to reach that point of awareness and consciousness if you're a total dick. You know,
Right. It's like a universal safeguard.
yeah, it really is. You know, God is not an idiot. He does not give toddlers pistols, right? So, you know, it's like, oh, look, I'm going to leave all these guns in this preschool. I'm sure it'll be fine. You know, everything is kind of a self-gating function where you can do certain things once your consciousness is beyond the point. I mean, like, you guys know how I use most of the stuff that I can do. I mean, it's quite literally just to try and help people with physical things, and, you know, to alleviate what their perceived suffering is on a physical level. And the reason I do that is because the physical form isn't really the attribute that you're trying to nudge or move or kind of shift. For me, what I'm trying to go for is kindness, right? I want people to be able to experience kind of a peace and a kindness. And when their physical form is dinged up, it makes it harder, right? You know, for all of us, myself included. It's much easier to see and to perceive things as good when you're not hurting. You know, if you're suffering, it's very difficult. My stepmom actually wrote a book called Beat Chronic Pain, an Insider's Guide, because she's been in chronic pain for 37, 38 years now, you know, which is a long time. She had a tumor inside of her spine, and they had to open up her vertebrae, sever her nerves, remove the tumor, and then patch her back. And they told her, you know, you'll never walk again. And she actually, as it turns out, her body rerouted the nerve pathways through other pathways so she can walk. The problem was it feels like her legs are asleep, and the skin is hypersensitive. So if anything brushes against it or bumps it, it feels like she's being burned, and the interior is numb. And so, you know, she described it to me as walking is kind of like having to throw kind of concrete pillars that she just loosely has control of, which is why she can drive during the day, but she can't drive at night, because if she can't see her feet, she doesn't know where they are. You know, in her particular experience, the physical component was very damaging and detrimental, and it made it hard for many, many years, you know, for her to get a grasp on it. You know, the first couple of years, she's a really wonderful, kind, brilliant woman, and for the first couple of years, she was drugged out of her mind. And then she realized, I don't want to do this. And then she just tried to start figuring out mechanisms to cope. And it was, to say difficult, I think is probably an understatement, because it was really profoundly hard. But eventually she did it. But that's the thing, is to find kindness on the other side of the physical pain and suffering is hard, right? So for me, most of my skill set I use to try and nudge things forward technologically for humanity, and kind of palliatively knock out suffering where I find it, which is usually kind of on a one-on-one basis with people, because most everybody has some ailments. You know, what I was doing in New York was training doctors on the new laser stem cell procedure that I do. And that's kind of been what I've been traveling all over the country doing. I think in the past week, I've trained seven or eight doctors, you know, on how to use lasers and stem cells to kind of just very rapidly eliminate people's physical ailments, which, you know, hopefully becomes sort of the new norm. Because, you know, the idea for me in that particular thing is that your body has all of the information stored for your body. So if I can take your own stem cells from your body, it's very beneficial for you. If I use, say, mesenchymal stem cells from some, you know, extraneous source, it's a little different. It's kind of like, you know, if your car gets in a wreck and you just said, I'm going to put a bumper on it, and you just grabbed a random bumper, right? That's kind of the effect of using someone else's stem cells. And gets a little technical, but where science is currently, you know, they would say like, oh, well, no, it repaired it. Yeah, I know it has the appearance of fully repairing it, but it's not your DNA. And there's a whole lot of information encoded. You know, humans aren't just meat suits. There's a lot of stuff happening on a whole lot of subtle levels, and there's a lot of encoded information. You know, I mean, you really have most of the information to rebuild physical form isn't on the body. you've got coding instructions there, but the actual information is contained in the proximate field around the body. It's almost as if nature came up with the cloud for data storage before we did. Totally impossible, but it's a whole lot like that.
Yeah.
You know,
So, yeah, I'm excited because you're going to bring your techniques to Mount Shasta.
In
I
July.
am.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm super excited to come to Mount Shasta. I have been really wanting to get it. Literally, I've been wanting to come up there for years. So this is the perfect opportunity to do this.
Yeah, it's great. We're going to be doing a workshop, and then immediately afterwards, you're going to be here for 2-3 days working with individuals.
Yep.
And
So for people who have no idea what this procedure is with the lasers, will you describe it a little bit?
Sure. So basically the kind of the concept is you've got all these cells that are dormant, they're asleep in your body. Now there's two big factors here. So kind of the prevailing wisdom has been focused around a thing called very small embryonic like stem cells, or V cells. And so myself and my partner who've been working on this, she's an MD in California, we spent almost a year working with UCLA trying to quantify all of the data sets around this, because I wanted to really be able to thoroughly say, okay, this is what we have, this is what we're doing, this is the degree to which we're doing it. Which is, I mean, honestly, that's just scientific rigor. You should be doing that anyway. But I hadn't really seen it. I had seen other people kind of tinkering around with that, but they had never really answered the questions that I had, at least to the degree of clarity that I felt, was really necessary. So we spent a long time kind of figuring that out and doing flow cytometry to look at, how many cells are we upregulating? How many populations of stem cells are we, turning on? What is the growth rate and that kind of stuff? So we could kind of quantify all that stuff. So we did that, but the process was originally thought of as, these very small embryonic like stem cells. And the thing that's cool about those, because we did show that we expand the population of those cells. The thing that's really cool is when you're looking at stem cells, you're looking at how much can they differentiate? How much can they basically become something else? And so these express pluripotency, which just means they can literally become anything in your body except a sperm and an egg. That's the only thing they can't become. And because they're super, super tiny, they can roll right past the blood-brain barrier, so I can get them to move into the brain and differentiate into, new neurons or whatever is necessary to kind of get somebody to amp up their healing. So that was kind of the precept of all this stuff, was we're going to work with these very small embryonic-like stem cells and get them spooled up. Now, the other big benefit of them is telomeres or telomeres, depending on where you're from, are kind of this repeating sequence at the end of your DNA. And the idea is it's like the aglet on a shoelace, the little banding that keeps it all held together. So when your genes kind of are recoded and replicate, and they go through, your cells go through this mitotic spindle formation and mitosis, and they read up the code. Well, the more precision whereby you're able to read that and replicate, the better your cells, right? So in a bad environment, aberrant cell reading results in cancer. That's kind of like the worst case scenario. Is you're going to have really broken cells that are unchecked in growth, that are doing really bad stuff and just spitting out copies. What you really want is you want all these healthy cells to have perfect encoding. And so in theory, the longer the strands of telomeres at the end of your DNA are, the more of that sequence that you have, the more you're able to line up everything every single time. And every time your cells replicate, you lose, say, kind of on the low end, about 25 pairs of those, the high end, about 250. So if you're living poorly, every time your cells replicate, you're losing about 250. You're doing everything right, you're still losing about 25. So as you get older, you're reaching this thing called the Hayflick limit, which is how many times the cells can divide before they become totally aberrant or can't divide anymore. And the thing that's wild about the V cells is they have no telomeric degradation. So it is literally as if you had day zero stem cells. So you had your umbilical cord from the day you were born, and you were able to pull out all these brand new little happy cells. And so when you take tons of those and you reperfuse them into someone's system, they go where they're supposed to go. It's encoded for your own physiology, and they have zero degradation. So it's basically you're getting your baby stem cells back the day you do it. So that in and of itself is pretty huge. The thing that was even wilder, though, is when we were looking at the results we were getting versus the test data that we were getting. So we'd show that we were expanding these cells, but cells take a while to go through the process of differentiation to become whatever they're going to become. So the fastest replicating cells that I know of are these, type of lymphocyte called inosophils. And so inosophils can replicate in about 6 hours. So in theory, if everything were just becoming these inosophils, it takes 6 hours to become those. Then after that, you'd go through a proliferation process where the numbers would increase, and then they would start to replicate. Well, what we were finding is we were finding changes in 15 to 30 minutes that were really profound changes, changes in people's vision, changes in people's cardiac function. And it was happening too quickly. So then we had to kind of go back and go, okay, great. So we know we're expanding these things mechanically and we have these cells to play with. But what's the other component of this? What else is happening? And so kind of the working theory right now is that when you take a liquid crystalline matrix, right? So plasma, the primary fraction in your blood, it's aqueous. But that means by very nature, it's kind of this beautiful crystalline structure. So people don't really think of water as a crystal, but it really is. I mean, it's this very beautiful crystalline. In your body, it stereoscopically stacks, not as H2O, where it's just kind of this random jumble of molecules, but H3O2, where it's, stacking vertically, and it builds kind of this hexagonal lattice as it moves up. And so when you have a liquid crystal, you're able to encode information in it, and you're able to pump energy into the system. And so kind of the working theory right now is that we take this liquid crystalline matrix, that is our plasma, we pump in all of these coherent photons from the lasers that we're using, and then that expands the energetic level. And so everybody's familiar with a battery, right? A battery is kind of it's a storage device that stores energy, and it's a slow charge and then a slow discharge. This seems to function more like a capacitor, where there's a ton of energy that goes in and then it all drops out really quickly. So what I've been doing is I use the lasers and I charge the plasma, and then I set it to a specific frequency. And so it's entrained with 4 different channels of laser, so that it's kind of like a cord that makes it very individual, and it locks in all of your plasma at this particular frequency. Then I reintroduce it via IV, and then take the laser at that same point, at that same frequency, and can move it kind of like a homing beacon, because it's attuned to the same frequency to any point in your body. And then once the plasma reaches that point in its charge state, it drops back to a ground state and releases a ton of photons. And so mitochondria, which are kind of like the power plant, and we had talked about this before, they're, the powerhouse of the cell. They actually communicate with little femtosecond bursts of light. And so if you suddenly get a tremendous amount of light released in this local environment, I'm positing that it's basically a huge signal with all of the resources to turn on the different components in your body. And so, 2 weekends ago, we were actually where you guys are now in Sedona. We were actually just outside of there. We drove through and then stopped kind of on the upper edge of Phoenix, and we were doing a training for a couple of doctors there. And one of the patients had a thing called retinitis pigmentosa. So basically, his eye, he had been blind for about 14 years, and his eye wasn't working. And when that happens, when your eye is actually occluded, your brain kind of shuts down the signaling from your optic nerve, because again, you're a very efficient system. If you don't have to waste energy, you're not going to. And so with this, we injected the plasma after we had charged the plasma. And when we started, we were moving our hand, and and all this is on video, because it was a little shocking for everybody, even everybody there. You could move your hand 2 inches in front of his face, no response. Then at the end of the procedure, you could move your hand 16 inches in front of his face, and he would track your hand. What was crazy is I said, well, what are you seeing? And he said, nothing's happening. And so it was wild, because even though his eyes were tracking, his brain was not yet connected. And so he was completely unaware. It was an autonomous function that he was able to use his eyes and track my hand, even though he was consciously not registering that his eyes had re-engaged. And so actually, as of last week, he's had to start wearing sunglasses, because now he's getting so much light in that it's disturbing to him. So, which is great because it's just a process. It's a process whereby your optic nerve reconnects, and then everything starts to move and re-engage, and then you start to process light, and it comes back on the way it went out, right? So you regain it the same sort of order that you lost it. And so it's a really beautiful process to see that sort of stuff. But again, it happens so quickly, right? The cells in the first half an hour that we were doing that procedure, they're not differentiating to become new nerve cells. That doesn't happen, right? Cellular biology suddenly doesn't check itself out. So there's an entirely different mechanism whereby you're using light to provide a signal and to provide energy into a kind of effectively a closed system so that everything gets switched back on. And so that's kind of the process in a nutshell. But it's beautiful because it allows me to, let's say if somebody has, say their eyes and their knee, what I'll actually do is I'll entrain the frequencies to 2 different rates so that I can re-inject one and get it to one location and then re-inject another and get it to move to another location without any crosstalk. And the way you do that is you modulate the frequencies so that they're effectively kind of, the term would be sort of offset primes, so that there's no commingling of the signal. It's actually very fun to me because this is where I hope medicine goes in the near future, where you're using your body and you're just providing it the resources it needs to fix itself. Not where you're taking some very daft, slow-witted pharmaceutical compound and going, give me a bigger hammer, hit it harder. It's not very clearly thought through. And this, I think, is using light as a more elegant solution.
It's beautiful. And Jules and I came and visited you with another friend, and you worked with us, and we could feel the shift happening pretty quickly. And it was then Jules and I said, hey, we've got to bring this to our community. So this is why we're inviting you to come to Shasta and share it with a few people that will be drawn to be there.
So can you talk a little bit about what else you've seen in terms of people, like the effects on people of this treatment?
Sure. So let's see. Things that I've found really neat. Woman with Alzheimer's who quite literally could not, remember anything in her checkbook. Couldn't really. I was talking to her son. Her son actually had me treat her because he thought he was going to have to get a home health nurse and, kind of move it up to that point because things had degraded to that point. And so quite literally the day after the treatment, you could see kind of the light come back in her eyes. But the day after the treatment, she was able to remember things and do everything. And he was, I think, she was happy, but he was relieved. That was great. And then people with impinged joints, one fella couldn't move his shoulder over about here. Actually, and this was the one I'm thinking about was months ago, and the one I just did literally yesterday in New York. Same thing. The fella who had a really bad stroke and couldn't move his arm over here, and by the end of the day, he was putting his arm over his head, and that kind of stuff. Those are incredibly compelling to me. I actually really like working on people with Parkinson's. That's a really fun. One fella came in a couple months ago with Parkinson's and literally couldn't use his phone when he came in. And by the time he left, he was able to text, and he was gleeful that he had, regained enough dexterity and, in an hour that he could use his phone again. And things like that, they're really great to me because, you're just allowing people's bodies to do what they are going to do. They want to be in a proper state. They don't want to be dysregulated. You're just giving it a nudge so that it can fix itself to do what it wants to do. And there's so many different. Actually, one for my like me personally that really got me was my dad's heart. He has congestive heart failure, and so his ejection fraction was at 21%, which is, for anybody who knows anything about EF, that's an incredibly low number. Usually you should be kind of 45 to 50 would be the normal range. 55 would be exceptionally good. And his was 21. So he literally couldn't walk to his mailbox without getting out of breath. And it was kind of a bummer. They had put him on a thing called a milrinone pump, which is, I will definitively state, one of the worst pieces of medical engineering I've ever seen in my entire life. It's a pump that you wear that you have a PICC line that goes into the top of your heart and drops this milrinone, which is a PDE4 inhibitor, just increases the contractile function of your heart. But it drops it directly into the vena cava in the top of your heart. And it has to, because the stuff is so acidic. If it doesn't get volumized that large or that quickly with a very large volume of blood, it will burn you, right? So it's just really bad. The problem is it's run by batteries. It only lasts 3 days.
Oh, no.
They know full well that it's going to decrease your lifespan by about 6%, but it will make you more able to function. So they had him on that. They had him on a thing called amiodarone, and then, which is another thing to regulate your cardiac rhythm, and then a thing called Eliquis, and all of those things it was just destroying his quality of life. So I finally convinced him to let me do this procedure on him. And he was actually, I shouldn't say I convinced him. I convinced him to let me talk to his cardiologist. And after explaining the process on the phone to his cardiologist was very excited and said, "That sounds awesome. He should totally do that." And literally you could hear my dad go, very begrudgingly, like, "Damn it, I'm going to have to let him do it." Because no matter who you are to the rest of the world, you're still somebody's punk kid, right? Like, they changed their diapers. What could you possibly know? And so he finally let me do the thing. So we drove out to North Carolina and did the procedure on him, and his ejection fraction is now at 36%. So
Wow.
he got off the milrinone pump, which was great, because when the nurses were taking it out, they said, "We've never seen someone come off of this." And when he actually was put on the milrinone, they said, "You're going to have this until you die." Like, it's because the idea is you've reached this threshold level with the congestive heart failure that your function is so low, you have to have that thing to keep your heart expressing enough contraction to keep you going throughout the day. And he really, it as much as I bitch about it, it was actually a good thing for him, because it gave him enough energy to get to the point where he was able to let me do this thing and kind of fix him up. But, to ditch that, to ditch the amiodarone, to ditch the Eliquis, I think actually now his other cardiologist, not the one who was so excited about this, but the more stalwart older fellow that's been his cardiologist for a while, is not really terribly thrilled because, as bad as it sounds, because I don't think he understands it. It sort of defies convention, because congestive heart failure is just that. It's heart failure. The idea is not, do we make it better? It's just, can we slow down the progression and decrease it over time? And you guys know Tiffany that works with me. Well, Tiffany, type 1 diabetic for 33 years and no longer a type 1 diabetic.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. And that was a good one. But that was simply, basically taking those cells and doing a couple of other things, and then moving them into the pancreas, and then it's a non-invasive thing, right? And then you move them into the pancreas, you get them to differentiate into beta cells in the pancreas, then they just start cranking out insulin. And that's how that works.
So she's officially producing her own insulin now.
Yeah, she makes her own insulin. Yeah, so you can actually see the C-peptide in her blood. So, and it's wild too, because we track it with a Dexcom every day, and it's kind of cool because you'll see that she'll eat something and it'll go up a little bit, and then whoop, and it'll just drop off the map, and it goes down, like she'll go to bed, and she went from 27 units of long-acting insulin, for those of you to whom that means anything, and about 20 to 40 fast-acting units of insulin in a day, to 1.5 units of long-acting insulin. That's it. Yeah. So every now and then, if she's going to go out and pick out on something, she'll still balance it out with some of the fast-acting.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, her normal routine is, instead of 12 long-acting in the morning and 15 long-acting at night, it's now 1.5 long-acting at night, and that's it.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a profound shift. It's still not really done, in my opinion, though, because it takes a while for the system to kick back on. And oddly enough, it's not so much the pancreas that's the issue. It's the connectivity systemically for it to regulate. That's what I've noticed, because it's kind of wild because, and again, like I said, we track it with Dexcom all day, every day. And you can see these kind of odd spikes where it goes up and then boink, and it drops down, and the pancreas kicks on and produces all this insulin, and it just drops her blood sugar like a stone. And then it kind of slowly goes back up and then whomp, drops it like a stone again. But it's kind of wild. I mean, I think the thing that's good about that is to know that it's possible, right? For something that you're told, oh my gosh, it's something you're going to have to contend with forever. Maybe, but science is a point on a line, and the best things that we can do now will probably seem pretty laughable, in 1,000 years. But if we're doing our job right, we, the scientists, we're pushing it forward, right? And we're going into the places where we don't understand things. We don't know all the mechanisms. We just keep pulling a thread. And I think I said this the first time we spoke, to me, science and consciousness and spirituality, it's all the same thing. In its most pure essence, it's a search for the truth, right? And you have to unabashedly just go for it. And without any bias, you have to pull the thread, even if it leads you to places where it's uncomfortable. I mean, because I got to tell you, when your consciousness hops up and starts to pop up to different levels, it's uncomfortable, right? You have to process through a lot of things that are very difficult, brutally difficult. In fact, I would say that, kind of the third little transition point, that I went through, it was arguably the worst thing I've ever gone through in my entire life. It was horrific. I would not wish that on anyone. But
this the one where you're processing your past life experience?
No, there's one more kind of after that, and and I'm sure, who knows, maybe there are lots more beyond that. But for me, the first one was kind of the single life thing, and the second one was actually easier, but that was the multiple life thing, and then the third one was just kind of more like a test where you have to opt for love and kindness or power, right?
Oh, wow.
And the interesting thing is the universe sort of conspires to make your entire reality the most brutal test of that for you, whatever your particular bearing is, and to ferret out any little bitty kind of intangible dark spots, anything that's left that's sort of not really shiny and positive, it just finds it. And, it's kind of like the old construct, sort of the thought puzzle of, what happens if an inanimate object is, hit by an indestructible force, right? Or not an inanimate, an immovable object is hit by an indestructible force. In theory, if you have something that's indestructible and you place something of infinite mass on top of it, it's exerting this total force. Nothing happens from the outside. As long as things are fine, it looks totally stable. If you have a subatomic flaw, even the tiniest little flaw in that thing that's receiving the infinite mass, it explodes at the speed of light, just, and that's kind of what happens is, and I'm sure there's more to come, but from my perspective, that at that particular point, all of the little dark spots are ferreted out and put under load. And the testing process is brutal. It basically breaks down every construct that you think, that you associate to, that you would hold to be you, and you just kind of break it all apart and have to find out what's really there. And the last assessment is, it really does come down to, do you go for love? Do you go for power? And, as my experience of this particular universe is that the baseline frequency, sort of the substrate that underlies all of the tangible reality that you can encounter, is oscillating at the frequency of love. And that's, it's sort of just the substrate below this whole place. So if you're building something and you want to look at the one common factor, what holds everything together, that's it. And, and maybe in different universes or different places, it might be different. Maybe it's humor, which would probably be a hell of a universe to be in. But here it appears to be, at least my experience thus far has been, everything is fundamentally oscillating at a frequency of love. And so if you engage with all things from that standpoint, and you have enough of it in yourself, and you can kind of make it coherent, kind of be a love laser, then you have the opportunity to do a lot of things and move things in different ways. Also, from my own perspective, the things that you focus on shifts, right? So initially you're sort of doing these things because you want to attain something personally. And this was my own experience. Then you move to the sort of the midpoint transition, and things, you kind of drop it out and you just kind of want to relax a little bit and, confer with the people around you and maybe convey some of the information from your experience and see what their experience was. And it's more of a communal thing, but it's still a smaller thing. And then kind of beyond the third point, you really kind of go, wow, that was pretty rough. I think I really want to help. And if you opt to stick it out here, you really want to try and help humanity as a whole, right? Because we've got, I don't know if anybody's seen the news lately, but it turns out there's a lot of stuff going on that we could probably use help with, And so for me, kind of the lens that I try and do that through is just technological things, try and move things forward technologically, with a certain degree of aplomb. I like to have a smile and kind of be a little silly about it when I do it, but because that's, I guess, sort of the way that I'm structured. That's sort of the persona that I have to move through the world.
It's a kind of fuel. It's like a joy fuel.
Yeah, it is actually. And the more I can help, the more joyous it is.
Sure.
It's really, it is. It's a self-perpetuating thing because, you enjoy. Now, if it all felt completely flat, luckily I would kind of go, meh, because you can sort of control your own volition, right? The expression of your own volition, the expression of your choice. You definitively cannot control the outcome of everything, right? Because it's a very beautiful, very ginormous tapestry. And with a limited perspective as a human, it's very difficult to see that. I always tell people, for anybody who thinks that all of this stuff is, random, look at like the fine structure constant of matter, kind of what shows how things collate and coalesce to become what we see as reality, right? From a subatomic level up. It's kind of precise because, if say like 0 point, and then you go about, 13 decimal places past that or digits past that, if you have a 3 and you shift it to a 4, the universe explodes at the speed of light. If you shift it to a 2, the universe implodes at the speed of light. So to say that it's not a very accurate system with a lot of interrelated things would maybe be wrong. I think it's so precise and so multifaceted and beautifully layered that it's almost unfathomably impossible for a human consciousness to process through it in a normal sense. And I think that's one of the things about trying to expand your consciousness that's sort of a beautiful function, of being a human, is you can experience reality through multiple layers of awareness, right? You can experience the awareness of yourself as an individual, and you can blow your expanded consciousness out to be the size of an entire universe, and you can sort of dial in and communicate with anything at any level of creation therein. You want to talk to a star? Hey, go talk to a star. You want to talk to a planet? Talk to a planet. And I think actually that's probably one of the neater things for me about human consciousness is its malleability of form. You're able to change and to see things from different perspectives. I think that's really kind of, in the most literal way, a very divine gift.
Beautiful. And that's what we need to do with the rest of humanity, to share that understanding of, hey, this is not rigid. It can let go of your concepts and let's really just flow together instead of this aggression that's happening right now. But I think that's part of the breaking down of the old structures, and we just have to kind of celebrate that aspect of it as the energetic of love and consciousness is growing behind the scenes, so to speak.
Well, it's a beautiful place because it allows for a lot of growth, and you've got to have something to push against, right? If it's a frictionless environment, you can't move, right? If you try and run on a frictionless surface, you don't move, right? You actually have to have something to push against. Luckily, there's plenty of stuff in the world to push against right now. So we are not at a loss. The three of us will never be at a loss for things to help or to do.
Well, Alcazar says that, well, you came here to experience duality. So you need a duality. You need the
I,
opposite. Yeah.
Right.
I think that's very well said. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is kind of a cool segue into the morphic field of humanity. In our first part one with you, you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake. So his concept of the morphic field, and within Stargate work, Alcazar, our guide who we channel, talks about the morphic field of humanity, how we're all connected. And essentially there's this fundamental theory that's posited by Cryon and other channelers as well as us, which is that humanity is headed not toward individuals becoming enlightened so much anymore, but that there's this collective enlightenment process that's wanting to happen on the planet. And what Alcazar's actually described is like, with the work that we're doing and many others, it's like we're reaching a certain level of consciousness and then we actually plateau there so that it can be shared with the collective, and then we go further. So it's like we're taking these steps together, and people who are impatient, he's saying like there's nothing to do, like we're moving on this greater journey together. And I guess my question for you, Ian, would be, as somebody who may have blasted through some of those levels already, what's your perspective on all of this and humanity's evolution and who we truly are?
Well, it's definitely moving up. And I humorously, I kind of like the idea of, Alcazar's approach of everything in humanity shares kind of a common morphic field. And that's true, right? Everything is related. I just, in the back of my head, I always kind of have this thing going, except that one dude, that one guy, he's not part of it, and how just implausibly disjointed this one guy would be, kind of, just the one guy that isn't part of humanity that just happens to be here. It's like the error in the code of the universe.
Yeah.
Jim Bob doesn't apply to the morphic field of humanity. I do think there is an evolution of consciousness that's been going for a very long time. And you see, my perspective has been, you see spikes in it over time, right? And it's moving up. As long as you kind of graph the trend line, it goes up.
Yeah.
And even in points where it goes up and it dips down profoundly, it's still moving in an upward trend. If you go back a few thousand years, I can definitively say that it's gotten a lot better here. And I think it will continue to get better. And consciousness to me is a lot like points on a bed sheet, right? So if you take one point on a bed sheet and you elevate it really rapidly, the things that are the most proximate to it will move up, right? So with you guys doing effectively elevation of people's consciousness and their awareness, when you pull those people up, they'll hop up. They'll hop up the most profoundly. The people that are proximate to them will be, in accord, moved up as well, but not as much. And then the people that are proximate to those guys, not nearly so much. But still, kind of when you look at the aggregate of how that moves, yeah, we're all moving it forward. I'd like to think that maybe the heavy lifting doesn't need to be done by any one particular person anymore, the way it has historically been done, but perhaps more through lots of people who have access to lots of things. There's sort of a cultural calculus that's occurring where it used to be, people always talked about technology expanding at an exponential rate. And I would say that is actually wrong. It was the population was expanding at a geometric rate, and hence the data points that were inputted from that population expansion seem to appear kind of as if it were happening exponentially. Now that you have the population expanding and you have people's communication so much more fluid than it ever has been, right? The ability for you guys and myself to stream back and forth and to share ideas and concepts at any point across the world in real time allows for sort of a third axis. So you've got something that is growing geometrically, but then it's also growing in a different axis. So you've got kind of this 3-axis thing where instead of a squaring function, you've actually got a cubic function. And the volume of information and the rate that that's growing is kind of like this cultural calculus in 3D. And so I think it allows for more and more people to pull up more and more points of light and change the consciousness all over the world. So, historically it had been, and I think there's still this kind of going on, but it had usually been, there was kind of like one real big high point. You've got your Buddha, your Jesus, your Krishna, Zoroaster. I mean, there are guys from time to time that pop up that really change things. Even David Hawkins. Hawkins was a really very, very, very evolved soul. And those guys really profoundly change how the world moves. I think now it's lucky that it gets to be a little bit more distributed, because there are more people who are tapping into more things. Just the way you guys are channeling in information, right? The earth is a little bit of a backwoodsy sort of place. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and that might sound a little peculiar, but it's a big universe. There's a whole lot happening here, and it's very safe and comforting to kind of pull the blankets over your head and go, there's nothing else. It's only this small reality. And when you shift the aperture down to this little bitty thing, there's not much that's scary out there that can hurt you. It's when you take the covers down and you open the aperture up and you really see what's going on. You're like, wow, big universe, lots of stuff happening. We're not the only game in town. Right. There's a lot of stuff happening here. That's when I think the consciousness does expand. And I think there's an inherent push, kind of what Alcazar was saying about, being here for a duality. That's very true. You are here to experience that. And we have to have something to push against to propel our growth forward, right? If you go to the gym, you put weights on the bar. Again, you need resistance. That's why it's called resistance training. That's not an isolated thing. It's the same for your consciousness. You want to grow your consciousness. You want to move the planet forward. You get pushback, right? It's resistance training for your consciousness. And that is kind of this entire divine milieu that we're in right now, is sort of like a gym for consciousness. We go through and play and do all these really groovy things, but you sign up for it, and there are pitfalls, and there are also wins and rewards. And sometimes you get the special magical token that allows you to do really nifty stuff. But that's kind of the beauty of it here. I do definitively agree that as a species, we are trying to push forward. But like anything else, when you get that expansion, you're also getting the concurrent contraction, right? There are people who do not want to change.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't want people to become aware. The guys who want to put fluoride in everybody's water. I mean, that's downregulate thyroids. It's probably not going to play so well. But it's much easier to control a populace. But I think that's kind of a fear-driven thing, right? Because if you realize there's so much more, it's Malthusian dynamics, right? It's the idea that there's only so much to go around.
Yeah.
That's a very misguided concept.
Yeah.
The beauty of humanity historically, and from my perspective, is that it's always wanted to push out and it always wants to grow. This is why I think even though I think there's some real inherent pitfalls to, space travel, one of which, gamma rays when you move outside of the magnetosphere, that are problematic. However, I love the idea of kind of getting people inspired about pushing their bounds and moving out. And, historically, that's been kind of the thing about, going out and hopping on a sailboat and going to the other side of the world and finding a new path to, India. And that brings people together. The idea of a new world, where you can go and where there's opportunity. Space in a lot of ways is like that to me. The ocean actually in a lot of ways is like that to me. We have charted very little of it, and it's right here. Those sorts of things are compelling. And I just think it's consciousness wanting to push us forward, but we have to have the resistance to do it. And I do think in aggregate, it's expanding, but it's a cycle. I think it will kind of go whoop, and then I think it'll contract a little bit. And then I think, in a few thousand years, it'll probably expand a little bit. So, I'm here for the ride. It's fun.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah, I do feel like very clearly sometimes my own superconscious being so enamored with this reality because of the kind of way we're shielded from ourselves, and we go through all of the emotions, and we're like, like in the dark to a certain extent, but there's like such a beauty. It's like you don't give the Oscar for like the screenplay that's just all like, nothing. The Oscar goes to like the intense deep journey.
And the Oscar for most vanilla screenplay goes to
we're on like we're on the Oscar award winning planet here, like we're in it.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, so my background, I actually studied molecular biology at UC Santa Cruz. And then I went on to find Stargate. And to me, it was because it was an experience that I basically fell in love with it and decided to pursue this as like my calling. And it was also the wisdom of Alcazar and the way he was able to work with like deep inner child stuff as if he knew me my whole life. But within the context of that journey, I've seen people in high vibrational energy fields have instant healings. Like I've seen some really cool stuff. And there's always been a part of me that wants to be like a soul scientist, that wants to just like, there is a science to this stuff.
There is.
So, yeah. And I know you've done some work with Lila Quantum, and you've talked a bit about the subatomic levels and how they inform the molecular structure and behavior. I'm just wondering if, like, what's your theory of everything, but from the perspective of quantum biology?
So, as best I've been able to kind of look at it, there are about 20 different attributes of form to make a thing here, right? So if I want to manifest something here, I need to effectively describe 20 different attributes of form, some of which are, length with height, the kind of the common stuff, but a lot of things are, pressure gradients and chiral rotation and vectors and all sorts of stuff, and vibrational field and, axial spin and, angle of ablation of this and that. But there are like very clearly 20 different things that I can isolate that have real import when things are manifest and tangible. And so this kind of from the quantum biological aspect of things, what's really fascinating to me is when I do these experiments where we can show there are non-local functions that express biologically, that it doesn't, it truly is, it's a quantum function. We're doing research hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles apart, and we're doing them randomized, double-blinded, at universities and different research facilities, and we're able to show that we can elicit these responses. One of them was a 20 to 29% jump in ATP instantly, with non-locality being an aspect of it.Here the research is happening thousands of miles away, and you're still able to, in a double-blinded, placebo-controlled, very randomized way, show this over and over and over. And when those experiments are done, a lot of the guys in the lab, we've done them multiple times because the results in terms of the classical physics of what we're taught just doesn't seem to make sense, right? You think of quantum functions as something that happens in a very cold space, not in a very hot, sticky environment with lots of moving pieces and biological components. But as it turns out, that's not the case. Nature is very efficient and has all this stuff dialed in to a level that we can't even begin to approximate yet. And I think there's a video of me actually with the Lila block on stage with a fella who had a histamine reaction, kind of an anaphylaxis for shellfish. And I brought him on stage because the guy who founded Lila Quantum said, look, do you think you can do like some sort of very demonstrable thing on stage so people understand that this is not just make-believe fairy dust? And I said, oh, yeah, absolutely. So I brought this guy up who had this really bad shellfish allergy. and I opened a can of crab meat and put a derma roller, which is just like this little roller wheel with lots of pins on it. And I rolled his arm with the juice from the crab meat, and it instantly popped up hives, the whole 9 yards. And then I put the can of crab meat in a little quantum block, which is just basically 2 plates of anodized aluminum with 4 little columns, but it's a point of high quantum flux. And the real special sauce there is how we're able to get that point of high quantum flux. That's kind of the magic ingredient there. But I just put it in, and then I lectured about waveforms. And, my common question is, picture a wave in your head. And everybody kind of pictures something doing this, which is a 2D representation of something that's much more complicated. So it's really more like spheres that all have a pressure gradient, and they're undulating, and they have a chirality. They're rolling, and, they have a color, which is also a dimension because it's, gauges the nanometer bandwidth of the light coming off of it in an emissive wavefront. So there are all these different attributes of form. You don't necessarily have to affect all of those to elicit a big change. In this case, the matter at hand was a histamine reaction, right? Because he's having a histamine, which is a biochemical reaction. My understanding is a little different, right? Histamine is kind of the outcropping of something energetically. When you look at just kind of the idea of a wave like that, well, when waves interact, they can either have a constructive interference pattern where they're moving at the same rate, or they can have a destructive interference pattern where they're kind of slapping together. When you have a destructive interference pattern, the wave loses energy because of the clash. When you have a constructive interference pattern, the wave gains amplitude and energy because things are coherent, and that resonance builds on itself, and more energy. It's called sympathetic harmonic resonance. So the energy in the system just continues to build on itself once it's kind of working in tandem with one another. So in this case, when you have a histamine reaction, there's a destructive interference pattern. And so what I did is I simply negated, by virtue of using the quantum block, a couple of different attributes of the form of crab meat. And then I took it out, and then put it on a new derma roller, and I derma rolled his other arm, and nothing happened. No histamine reaction. And everyone in the crowd at the end of the lecture, came up to the stage because it just didn't make sense, right? That you can have this really pronounced histamine reaction 1 second and then not another. But it's because it's not truly a biochemical function. That's a tertiary function. The primary and secondary things are waveform dynamics and then subatomic interaction. And then that coalesces to become a much larger expression as a biochemical product. But if you can knock out the subtlety of it at the level of the waveform, then it doesn't express as anything that's a detrimental interaction because you nullified that.
So it was sort of like the combination of the high quantum flux plus intention that you're putting in.
Yeah, which is actually with all of the doctors that I'm training for the laser system right now. I include a quantum block there because in a perfect world, if you're a medical professional, it means you have a certain degree of acuity and an understanding of physiology, and you understand how things need to function. That's terrific. If you're a healer, it kind of takes the base concept of a doctor, and then you add on the layer of high consciousness so that you can actually elicit much better responses, right? So in a perfect world, all doctors would really, in my estimation, be healers, where they have all of the technical attributes, they understand everything, they see how it fits together, but then they have the intent that's pure, that they want to heal you, not that they're wanting to get to the next patient so they can cycle through 10 people in an hour. Their whole intent is focused solely on helping you express your own consciousness in a form that is healthy, right? And so that's exactly it, Jules. It's trying to get positive intent expressed through physical media.
Beautiful. So I have a question. With these V cells and the blood plasma, you're saying that there's 2 effects. So is the laser light actually activating the V cells into differentiating and waking up?
Yeah, it wakes them up. So any hormetic stress, which is just hormesis, is kind of the process of, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, right? It's like a cold plunge. It's a cryo shock, right? And so I do 2 things. I use a cryogenic shock with ice, and to drop the temperature. And then I use the photonic stress. And so when you stress it that way, you end up with a much higher kind of waking up of all these things. You shock them through two different mechanisms. You can also do acoustic shock. You can hit them with sound, which effectively just oscillates them and, you know, makes them move, and that wakes them up too. So there are actually a bunch of different ways you can wake them up. But, you know, the net effect is you wake up a bunch of these little guys and then you kind of tune them. The thing that's, like you said, more to it than that is you've got the physical component of the cells. And so you wake up these cells, but it also increases progenitor stem cells in your own body. It turns those on. But the plasma itself, Einstein actually got his Nobel Prize for a thing called the photoelectric effect. And so when you have coherent light coming from a laser, you're pumping in a ton of photons in a coherent way. And so what happens is, at least this is my kind of estimation of what's likely, you've got the plasma and you're pumping in all this energy. And so there's an excitation of the electrons and they move out. And they're housing all of this photonic energy stored in here. And they've moved out. And then you re-inject it into the body and you kind of move it with the laser to get it where you want it. And then it goes back to ground state and it collapses down. And that's what I had alluded to earlier, is when it collapses down and the electrons move back into a ground state, all of these photons hop off the bus. And so it's kind of like you've loaded this entire thing with all of these factors that it needs to change itself energetically. Then you move it into position and then you release everything. And so all these photons come out and turn everything on and provide energy for everything to do what it wants to do. Then that's kind of the first wave. And then you get the differentiation after a couple days, and then you get the proliferation after a couple of weeks, and then you get the replication cycle that just kind of keeps going. So really, by the end of, say, 3 months after the thing, you're 2.5 to 3 months, what you see is what you get. That's kind of the end of that expression. But there's going to be the very kind of quick flash to bang where you see the stuff from the photonic expression. Then you're going to see the differentiation over the next couple of weeks. Then you're going to see kind of just the system build out. So, like, case in point, Carl, he had torn his meniscus. And so, you know, he tore the meniscus in his knee. So we brought him in, did the procedure, and he was back up and running within a week, you know, because it's just very rapid. And I've, you know, have pro athletes who come in for, you know, had one guy come in for his Achilles tendon, and I've had other guys come in for just general function. And it really is profound. So one of the guys, he's actually, I'm treating him again. He's coming in from Iceland, and I'm treating him again on Monday, today being Friday. So just 3 days from now, effectively. He is, or I think actually just turned 40, and he's a heck of an athlete. Used to be an Olympian, but his run time, like he did the NFL Combine. They do this thing for speed where they do a 40-yard dash, and the fastest run time recorded was 4.21 seconds for a 40-yard dash. And so this fellow, Blaine, just ran it in 4.15 seconds. So turning 40, no less. So he's outpacing all these, you know, 22, 23-year-old kids who are just coming out. And he can actually do it, but he's, you know, almost twice as old as they are. And that's kind of fantastic for me, because I like the idea of being able to take all these cells and all this energy and kind of put them in someone's physiology so that they are operating at a level that is effectively kind of superhuman. You know, they're able to do things that normally you wouldn't be able to do in that domain, because nobody's been able to do that before. You don't outrun the fastest guys around. And he's not a tiny guy. He's a very large, muscly guy. He sent me 2 videos. One was them clocking and videoing him running at a 4.15 for a 40-yard dash. And the next was doing a front squat with like 484 pounds. So, which is kind of comical. I mean, the guy's a unit. He is definitely a very, very solid physical specimen.
Well, that reminds me of your elixir.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of the same mindset. I very much enjoy being able to do things that kind of push the bounds of the physical form, right? Because it's got so much untapped potential. It really, I mean, even without, you know, doing things like cities where you effectively manipulate reality a little bit to do certain things, even without that, even if you're just playing by the meat suit rules, you can still level it up so much that you're, like Captain America serum kind of stuff, where you're just like, holy cow, how is that even possible? But in the case of like sheer physical strength, that's a pretty simple function, because your brain downregulates your muscular firing capacity to roughly 25 to 30% of what it can really do. And so it's called the central governor theory, basically, that your body doesn't want to allow itself to be hurt, so it just downregulates itself. And some of the things that I've developed allow you to sort of bypass that function. Again, not that I would tell everybody to do it, but it's really fun sometimes to be able to do things where you're just kind of operating at a superhuman level without pain.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it because I tried using it and then going out and doing some very intense exercise, and it was just like so easy. It was,
I know.
like, wow, it's like I can do it like that.
Yeah. Well, that's the funny bit, right? So like on the serums like Elixir and Olympic and all that kind of stuff. So when you take those things, they allow your cells to potentiate so much more energy, and they allow for a higher degree of skeletal muscle recruitment. So something that would be very exceedingly difficult, let's say you're pushing 24, 25% of your body's capacity, that's where you're capping out. And suddenly, if you've got, 60% capacity, the things that you would have thought were just about impossible when you're capped at 25% are just cakewalk easy. The one caveat I will say, because I've told so many athletes this, it sounds really cool and really great, but you don't really want to push it, because the couple days later, you will be more sore than you have ever been in your life, because you will have elicited muscle recruitment at a level that you have never done before. And so the kind of like second day soreness you feel will be second day soreness times 2, because you will have pushed all of those muscle fibers, which is not normal. Normally, your body kind of reserves that stuff, sort of fight or flight kind of a thing, where you're like, oh my God, I've got to throw a car off a baby. That's usually where you get those things. And so when you bypass it the way I've done it with, different molecular components, it's really awesome and it's fun to play with, but you don't want to do it every day. You kind of want to build up your level so that it's well beyond where you were, but not so much that you're going to damage yourself, because your muscles can actually handle a lot of load, but they have a lot of blood flow. All of the cartilaginous stuff, the stuff that's kind of chondrocytic in nature, just where your body's producing all the cartilage and ligaments and tendons and stuff like that, those things don't typically have as much adequate blood flow, so it takes longer to kind of retool them up. Your muscles adapt super fast, but your ligaments and tendons not so much. So you have to give it time, right? You can do, I mean, if you're really trying to make yourself kind of superhuman, you can do that sort of stuff, and then you can do like infrared saunas and red lights and lasers on your joints, pulsed electromagnetic fields, things that actually stimulate a certain flow. Like for myself, I use a lot of infrared stuff and a lot of PEMF, because the PEMF actually changes your bone density, right? It actually oscillates your bones a little bit, and you get much stronger bone.
What's your favorite,
and also, what's that?
What's your favorite PEMF device? You have like a beamer. What's your favorite?
Beamers are great. I like the pulse centers coils. They're really intense. If you crank them up, for people who come into the lab, I've got the chair in my lab that I put everybody in. Yeah. Crank it up, and people are kind of like, oh, it's a magnet, it's not going to do anything, and then you crank it up and their arms kind of yeah. Well, it actually does. Well, I mean, because you can elicit a muscular firing, you potentiate the nerves and it'll move their arm, and it's kind of a okay, magnets, and, well, it's kind of like the Lakovski chair I have, where I have people hold the lights, because you don't understand how much energy is flowing through you. And then when you grab the fluorescent bulb and the whole thing is lit up like a Christmas tree, you're like, I guess there's a lot of energy going through.
Describe this, because it's essentially Tesla coils on both sides, or what?
Yeah, it's a tuned Tesla coil. So you've got 2 Tesla coils kind of tuned, one sending, one receiving. And so you have a very high frequency, high voltage static discharge that's coming through in all of these different frequencies. And your body is the impedance point between the 2 coils. And so your cells can take in energy in all sorts of varied forms, right? As a system, the human form is very amazingly well designed, right? You can pull in energy from chemicals like food. You can pull in energy from elements like oxygen in the air. You can pull it in light. You can pull it in, static discharge from electricity. And your cells know what they need. So when you pulse a ton of frequencies through, it's kind of like running past the buffet line and picking out all the different components you want. Your cells actually know what they're deficient in, and so they take everything in. Right? It's just like eating food, where you pull in different nutrients based on what you're nutrient deficient in. Right? Your body is very brilliant. It does all of the heavy lifting. You just give it the resources. In the case of like a Lakovski chair, you simply pulse everything through, and it pulls out what it needs. A lot of people don't really think that those things are very germane, but they also, the same people typically think that pharmaceuticals rule the world. I would think that maybe there's a little bit more to it than that. So we aren't just meat suits, right? We're electrical, magnetic, photonic. We're our form. The beauty about a human form to me is that it operates on so many levels, right? It's so beautiful because it's an expression of consciousness, which ultimately, if you're going to try and retool human form, I think you're far more able to do that if you look at it, if you work the equation in the right direction, right? If you think we have consciousness because we have a form, that's not really true. You have a form because you have consciousness, and that consciousness wants to express.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Well, I just wanted to mention the other elixir that I love, that
Yeah.
is really, it's like you suggested I took it, and it's like instantly the brain fog that was troubling me, gone.
Oh yeah, the
Clarity,
neural, yeah.
gone. Yeah, this neural elixir is amazing.
Neural RX,
Yeah, totally amazing.
Yeah, that I made that for people with Alzheimer's very specifically. And so if you have some really horrendous cognitive deficit, it will fix it. If you don't, then it's like magic sauce for the brain. So it's a really, really, really great nootropic. So, and the thing, most nootropics, if you use them, you just basically, you take them, you get the effect, and then you're done. And I've played with a ton of them, and they're really good. But my thought was, okay, how do I retool the system so that someone can do this, and then at the end of the day, they're just better, right? And so that's what that serum does. Is it actually promotes neurogenesis, so you get more neurons, you get more mitochondria in those neurons. You get a different morphology, like the shape of the neurons is actually different. They have a longer axonal span, which allows for better communication. Then it breaks down tau proteins and beta amyloid plaques in the brain, which are kind of your body's protective mechanism to shield it from exogenous threats like, heavy metals and glyphosate, or endogenous stuff like, P. gingivalis in your mouth, or viruses or things like that. So your body kind of traps all these things, but over time we end up with a lot of it, and it starts to occlude neural function. So, but it's only one component of it. But that serum breaks that stuff down, because the reality is everyone is always neurally under assault from the time you're born. If we lived in some pristine environment 1,000 years ago, would not be the case. But here, where we're kind of lambasted with tons of EMFs, we're all surrounded by these little guys, which literally dysregulate voltage-gated calcium channel flow in the brain. There's enough of a field coming off that thing that it quite literally will inhibit the, influx and efflux of waste in your brain. So you're constantly being bombarded with things that are knocking us down. So the neural RX is just something that kind of sways that in your favor, so that you can kind of regain, like truly in a perfect world, I wouldn't have made it, because people wouldn't be lambasted with the stuff that's getting them. But Alzheimer's isn't actually an expression of a disease. It's the crossing over the tipping point of a protective mechanism for your body, where you've moved past the nexus where you're losing the battle with things that are degrading your brain. So everybody's brain is being put in some sort of position of assault all the time. It's just when it becomes critical that you've kind of hit the threshold where you can't keep up. I mean, we have this endogenous system called the glymphatic system, which is inside your brain, and it's a subset of the lymphatic system, and it opens up at night and uses cerebrospinal fluid and interstitial fluid to quite literally wash your brain. and pull out debris and other stuff that's kind of stuck there. But because it's a hydrostatic pump, it's a pressurized pump. As you get older, you lose energetics, right? And as cellular energetics go down, you literally just don't have the same contractile force for that system that you did previously. So you're not able to as thoroughly wash it. So it's kind of like trying to wash off the sidewalk with a garden hose that has a kink in it. And the older you are, the more of a kink it has in it. And so it just gets progressively worse and worse and worse. And so the debris starts to build up and cluster together. And then you reach kind of this tipping point where it just can't keep up anymore. And that's when you have the expression of, a lot of the cognitive deficits that you always see with, neurodegenerative disease. So this is just, this was kind of my way of like, I can roll that back.
Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome for that. I am the happy beneficiary of that myself. I take it all the time. The real plus there is at about week 3, it triggers a real outcropping of neurogenesis. And so you get this hippocampal expression of new neurons. And that happens every day, but it doesn't happen at this profound a rate. But because neurons are so resource consumptive, your brain is 2% of your body mass, but uses 20 to 25% of your oxygen. Your body doesn't actually want to pack on new neurons unless it needs them. So it goes through this process called synaptic pruning, where every day it just knocks out the new batch that you've made, unless you put your brain under some sort of really intense cognitive load in an entirely new and different pathway. So if you're doing the same thing, like if you say, I'm just going to get a better vocabulary, you already have a pathway for that. So it's myelinated, right? So those neurons are wrapped with a myelin sheath, and that's probably going to be a very well-developed path. If you want to keep the new neurons, do something radically different. So, learn how to knit, or learn how to juggle, or learn how to play bocce ball, something that you haven't done before that pushes you a little outside of your comfort zone, because then your brain goes, oh, damn, this is new. I better retool. And then it kind of wedges the neurons in place and cements them there. And then you actually have persistent growth. And so your neural function and hence your, perceived acuity go up over time, as opposed to, with most people, it kind of.
I'm going to get a drum set.
Oh, yeah.
That's okay. You get a drum set. I will bring my saxophone. We can jam. That'd be great.
Yes, okay,
I haven't got it yet, though.
But he's a natural, though. He keeps a beat with the music. I'm like the melody. He's the beat.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a day. It's on.
Yeah, so we've been on, and thank you so much for your generosity of time. And
I love this.
The reason I started by saying that you're different, it really is this, there's a super benevolence to you that I started to notice as I was listening to some of your podcast interviews. And I was like, wow, like there's really hope for humanity. Like there are people out there who have reached a level where they really want to help. And so I want to thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. And I by choice, I'm choosing to be here to do that very thing. And which is way the hell better than if you were like, you're really kind of a malevolent form. although I'd probably get the really cool collar and have a scar over my eye.
Yes, I'm pretty sure Stargate filters those. We filter them out, Ryan.
So Stargate.
Yes, they sense the high vibrational energy field and the channeling, and they stay away. So there's one question that Prageet wanted to ask, but I think he's forgetting right now. But it's about that information or consciousness field that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that intrigued us recently that our guide said, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, kind of out of the blue. Well, we've been invited to go to this tech conference.
Human plus tech.
To take the Stargate, and they're techies, but interested in spirituality. So we got invited to that. And I was just thinking about that. And then Alcazar just came in and he said, there's a lot of ego in the tech world. They're all trying to beat each other. He said, what's really happening is we're putting information into the field, and those guys that are open to it are receiving it. So it's not their creation as such. They're taking the information and adapting it to the 3D reality.
He's specifically saying the galactics are.
Yeah.
That is in fact my experience.
Mm.
Is all of the ideas. You can think of a person kind of as almost like a terminal, a computer terminal,
Uh-huh.
right? Where all of the information is out there and they're just plugging in to pull it down. And that's very true because and you see this historically. So two people will have the same idea at very opposite ends of the world, not because it's them pushing at the same rate. It's because, like I had said earlier, kind of with the analogy of being drawn up the mountain,
Mm.
consciousness expands and humanity is expanding in a very specific direction at a very specific trajectory, right? We are being drawn into the future because it's already there. The only thing, again, from my perspective, your consciousness slices reality into little bite-sized pieces with the arrow of time pointing in one direction, which I would say maybe not exactly totally accurate. I would think that it's probably kind of already expressed itself in both directions, and your consciousness just very politely and kindly parses that data in a linear progression for you to move through it. But it's already expressed. And because of that, it needs to reach certain points in the future, if you will. And so we're pulled that way, right? And those ideas are propagated through the field when it's time for humanity to move forward to a certain point, and the people who are open to it can hear it, right? So I used to get very kind of angst ridden about like, oh my God, I've got this great idea and I need to do this thing. And I would start jotting down drawings. And my mom still has all of my journals from when I was a little kid of all the different things that I drew. And what was interesting to me is that when I went back and looked at them, they all ended up becoming products, not of mine, just reality as a whole. People would take that and manifest it and make that thing. And I realized, oh, it's because it's meant to be. You're just tapping into the field of what is meant to be and what has to express in order for us to move to the next point.
Mm.
It's kind of like, getting the costume handed to you that, and now I'm hopping on stage as a lobster. You have to be given the costume so that you can express it at the right moment. And lo and behold, somebody hands you a lobster costume. And so, you jump on stage wearing your newfangled lobster costume. But that's because that was the part of the play that had to happen at that moment. And I think that's really how technology progresses, is the people who are open and attuned to it can pick it up. And then I think there are those unfortunate guys like Tesla and Walter Russell who are so open and attuned that they're seeing things, 100 years, 1,000 years out, which makes them seem like absolute nutters to most people because they are so far beyond the pale with what they're picking up. It's like long range sensors.
Mm.
They're picking up things that are like, oh no, in the future it will be this, and people go like, you're out of your ever loving mind. That's not possible.
You know what I think would have been cool is if Tesla hadn't gotten cheated out of his some of his revenue streams, he would have been able to be like self-funded in progressing his research.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that was, in a lot of ways, you see the world as you are, not as it is. And so one of the things that I've always been happiest about is like there have been things that have kind of, points that I've gone through that were really difficult, some of my own doing, some of external sources. And sometimes where I'm just kind of like, well, why would somebody ever do that? That seems so nefarious. And I'm actually, now I kind of get it. It makes me laugh because I'm actually happy that I don't see things through that filter, because perceiving things through the filter of everyone's out to get me, well, really, that's probably because you're actually out to get people in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And hence you perceive that in the world as the motivation behind things. If you really don't, you kind of go in as like the happy, starry-eyed unicorn thinking everything's love and rainbows, and it's great because that's sort of where you're at. And so you do really see the world as you are and not as it is. But Tesla, that actually was I agree, a bit of a misstep. And you have to factor that in, right? You have to factor in the message that you're trying to convey and to whom you're trying to actually convey that message. Because if you really want to effectively move humanity forward, sure, you can tap into things that are way far in the future, but the timing is very important. You have to be able to express it at the right time. And if let's say you wanted to shake up a certain industry like energy or, cancer or something like that, right? you can't just go, I've got the answer, here it is. You don't just slap the big red button and go, for 500, what is, and, explain it. You have to actually say, okay, how am I going to get this out? How am I going to do this over a protracted period of time so that it can actually engage with the culture and be evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary? We always talk about it's a revolutionary technology. In a broader sense, revolutions are generally kind of violent and fail with a lot of bodies dropped. Evolution is the process that nature uses to make things move forward. It's a pretty good process, so I think if you have access to revolutionary ideas and you have an awareness of how you're trying to get them out, then it's sort of incumbent upon you to dole that technology out in an appropriate fashion over time so that people can jump on the train as opposed to trying to jump on a train moving at 1,000 miles an hour, right? If the train's going down the tracks kind of slowly, everybody can hop on and enjoy it. If you try and jump a bullet train, probably not going to play so well, So.
Yay. So thank you so much.
Love talking to you guys. Happy to do it. And I love the way that you're able to express and bring a community together for this. It's truly, in the most literal sense, very expansive for consciousness and humanity as a whole. So I applaud what you're doing and can't wait to come up and see you guys in person.
Great.
Yeah, come
we
visit.
Look forward to it. Yeah.
Come visit us in our Mount Shasta Wonderland. Look forward to it. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ian.
Bye, guys. Much love, y'all.
Love. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.